So we've been working through a series on the book of Ruth, and we're into the last chapter today, chapter 4. And so let's begin with the story. So just a quick recap for those of you that haven't been here with us. The book of Ruth begins with this tragic tale of the family of Elimelech, who were experiencing famine in Bethlehem, so they traveled to Moab. Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their two sons Mahlon and Chilion. And while in Moab, the two boys married, and Elimelech died, and then both the boys died without having any children. And so Naomi experienced a complete devastation in her life, losing everything, losing future, losing family, losing support as this famine refugee in a foreign land. And she decides to go back to Bethlehem, where she now hears there's food again in Bethlehem. And Ruth decides to go with her. She tries to send Ruth and her sister back to their homes, and Ruth says, "No, where you go, I will go. Your God will be my God." And she has this amazing conversion experience where she chooses the God of Israel. And as the story unfolds, Ruth is transformed in her experience of the God of Israel, and Naomi is transformed from being lost in her grief to being someone who's able to look out for Ruth's well-being. And they encounter Boaz in Bethlehem, who's this Israelite man of power and influence and standing in the community, who also is a very godly man and very generous. And so as they experience God's faithfulness to them, God's provision for them in Bethlehem, they begin to be changed by that. And so we've looked at the themes of God's compassion, that our God is compassionate, and that in Naomi and Ruth's tragedy and loss, God saw them. He sees us in our distress. He cares about our needs. We've talked about God protecting and providing, and how in their encounter with Boaz, they experience God's provision, and how God often provides for our needs through his people, through the community of faith. And then we talked about God is faithful. And throughout this story, we've seen how God's generous love, his chesed, his faithful, enduring love for us, changes these characters, and it changes us. So that's kind of where we're at. And now at the end of chapter 3, Ruth has proposed to Boaz. Boaz asking him to redeem the whole family, rescue the land, and marry Ruth so that she can have an heir to carry on the family name. And Boaz agrees to it, but says there's another relative that's closer that has first dibs, and so we've got to talk to him first. So that's where we're at as we open the final scene in chapter 4. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. And then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. And thus ends the story. And so as we trace some of the threads we've been following through this little book into chapter 4, we see Boaz, the faithful Israelite, the guardian redeemer, the close relative. He's using his powers and his influence in the community to accept responsibility for Ruth, for Naomi, for their estate. You see how he arranges things. He gathers the elders and he gets the closest relative and he brings them all together. And then as he is speaking with them, he's using his influence to try to make sure that these women and this issue is taken care of properly. And so he first introduces, here's this land. And it's interesting, he introduces it as land that Naomi is selling. And he just kind of blows by that detail. Like, yeah, Naomi's selling the land, matter of fact, as if that's just normal. I don't think it was normal for the woman to have possession of the land and be offering it up for sale. But he just kind of blows by that detail, makes it seem like this urgent issue that needs dealt with right away. And the closest relative, he recognizes a good deal when he sees it. This land is available. He can add it to his family's property. It'll stay in the family. Everything is good by the law, and his estate gets bigger. Nobody wants to pass that up, right? So he says, sure thing, let's do it. And then Boaz introduces the next little detail. Right? See how he knows what he's doing. He's using his influence. He's using his power for good in this situation. And so then he adds the little detail. Oh, by the way, there's also this issue that needs dealt with. And he probably knows at this point that this guy's not going to be so interested in that. And so he plays the situation perfectly so that he is able to take care of this family and take care of these women. And so we see the faithfulness of Boaz, the loyalty of Boaz, the wisdom of Boaz, as he uses what God has given him, the power and the influence that he has, he uses it to protect, to provide, to care for this family. And so we see the character of God reflected in the character of this godly man. But we also trace Ruth's story through this book and how she begins the story as a barren widow who's been married for 10 years, unable to conceive, and she expresses her complete trust and faith in the God of Israel. And then throughout the story, you see her character, her courage, her belief in the law of God, her ability to challenge and to push and to say, no, this is what this law is really about. Will you feed us? Will you take care of our family? Will you do this for us? And she changes Boaz in the process, and she changes herself as she grows in her confidence and her faith in God. And at the end of the story, she's fully accepted by this community. The outsider, the stranger, the foreigner has become known in this community as a woman of standing, a woman of faith, a woman of valor, of courage and loyalty. So by the end of the story, the women of the community are saying to Naomi, Ruth is better to you than 7 sons. Now remember, this is a patriarchal society where the worth of a woman is defined by the sons that she bears. And Naomi has no more sons. And the villagers say to her, your daughter Ruth is better to you than 7 sons. Better to you than the perfect number of sons. Better to you to have this daughter than to be fully complete in our old understanding of what it meant to be a woman. So Ruth is just lifted up here. She's accepted, fully accepted as a member of the community and valued. And Naomi's story, Naomi, the one who at the beginning had lost everything, completely devastated. Now at the end of the story, her arms are filled. And the townspeople are saying, look, Naomi has a son. Naomi has a son. Naomi has a guardian redeemer in this child that will now carry on her family line. Her life is now filled where it was once empty. And as we said before, that doesn't mean she's going to forget her loss or her grief for her husband and her sons, but God has given her back hope for a future. He's given her back security for her life. He's given her so much in this. And even in God's kindness, even though we might look at this patriarchal kind of way that women's identities are wrapped up in their ability to bear sons, we might see how wrong that is from our perspective. But even God in his gentleness affirms her and says, here you go, Naomi, you have a son. You have worth. You have dignity. You have something to contribute to this community. So everybody's story is just nicely wrapped up by the end. There's a recognition by the community. There's an affirmation of identity. There's moving from tragedy and death to joy and birth. God is compassionate. God protects and provides for us. God is faithful. But that's not what this sermon is about. That was just the preamble so we can wrap up all those threads. This sermon is about God's inclusivity. That God draws people into his family. He's always welcoming and inviting and including outsiders to become insiders. So I want to look closer at the blessing that the elders give in this chapter and the genealogy at the end. Genealogies are always exciting in the Bible, right? Those are your favorite parts to read. You just love going through like Leviticus and... No, I'm kidding. So the elders and all the people at the gate said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who's coming into your home like Rachel and Leah. So hearkening back to the ancestors, to Jacob's two wives, Rachel and Leah, the ones who bore with their handmaidens, bore the 12 sons that made up the 12 tribes of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. And so there, if we skip now to the genealogy of David, we see that Perez was the father of Hezron, who was the father all the way down to Boaz, and then through Obed to David. And so they connect the story with the mothers who gave birth to the whole house of Israel, and then they funnel it down to the mother who gave birth through the tribe of Judah to the line that leads to Boaz and David. And so I want to talk today about these women that are mentioned in this story. And before I do, I want to connect it with the genealogy in the book of Matthew. Matthew begins his book with a genealogy that takes us from Abraham all the way through David to Jesus, showing that Jesus was in the line of David. And so Jesus is in this same family line. This family line that in Ruth leads us to David, in Matthew leads us all the way to Jesus. So Matthew writes that Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. We're going to stop there. Matthew goes on to Jesus and mentions another woman. And it's interesting here because most genealogies in the Jewish writings don't include the names of the women. It's patriarchal culture. They just talk about the fathers and who you're descended from and what family line you're part of. But here Matthew mentions 4 women, and in the part that we're reading, 3 women specifically by name. The first one is Tamar, the father of Perez, or the mother of Perez. The second one is Rahab, the mother of Boaz, and then Obed, or Ruth, the mother of Obed. And these 3 women, my argument is that they're included in the story because there's something that God teaches us through them. There's something that happened to these women. Their stories are all told in the Bible in different parts. And they're all significant women who changed the men in their lives by their faithfulness to God and by their courageous action. They inspired and they challenged the men in their lives to fulfill the heart of God's law. They were bold, they were courageous, and they led the men to greater faithfulness to God and to the vulnerable people around them. So first of all, Boaz knew that faithful foreigners could become part of Israel because of his mother Rahab. Boaz knew that this could work, that faithful foreigners can become part of Israel. So when he experienced Ruth, when he saw her faithfulness, when he experienced how amazing she was, how courageous and faithful and loyal and full of belief in the God of Israel, when he saw that, he knew that she could become an important part of their community because his mother had done the same thing. Do you remember the story of Rahab? Remember who Rahab was? Just give you a quick reminder as Israel's coming into the promised land in the book of Joshua, and the first city they encounter once they cross the river is Jericho. Jericho's a story where they march around the walls a bunch of times. Remember that story? But before they do that, they send spies into the city. And the spies are scoping out the city, trying to figure out what's going on in the land. And the people of the land have heard about the Israelites coming, this massive group of people that are marching their way in. And they know that's not a good sign for them. And so Rahab is the prostitute in Jericho. And she encounters the spies, and she hides them on her rooftop as the men of the city come to look for them to kill them. And it says in Joshua chapter 2, before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. So later on, so the spies made an arrangement with her. They said, sure, we'll do that. Hang a red thread out of your window. And when they marched around the city, the part of the wall that had the red rope hanging out of it didn't fall down, and Rahab's family was preserved, and God was faithful to her. Did you hear her faith there? Did you hear her confession of faith in the God of Israel? Her throwing her lot in with this foreign people that are coming in and taking over their land. And she says, no, I want your God to be my God. I'm going to join in with you guys. And so it says later on, Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. And we find out in Matthew she was the mother of Boaz. So this prostitute married one of the most powerful and influential men in Israel and had a child who became an ancestor of the greatest king and of God himself come to earth. Boaz knew that outsiders can be welcomed in, that the story you come from doesn't write the story of your future. Getting all emotional. I like that stuff. Secondly, Boaz knew the importance of a kinsman redeemer because of his great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, Tamar. Now this is a little bit of a different story. I don't know if you remember this one. It's from Genesis 38. And again, it's a story of a woman who is an outsider, a foreigner to Israel, who experienced rejection. She experienced abuse at the hands of the men in her life. But her courageous insistence that you need to be just, you need to do what's right, changed Judah. So Tamar's story is a story of the Levirate law, of where when a husband dies, the brother is supposed to take the wife to carry on the family name and have a child. So Tamar was the wife of Judah's oldest son. And the oldest son was evil in God's sight, and it says that God killed him. And so Judah gave Tamar to the next son. And the next son didn't want to give birth to an heir for his brother. And so he didn't impregnate her. And so God saw what he did was evil, and he killed him. And so now Judah has experienced both of his sons dying with this woman. And so he tells her, my third son isn't old enough yet. Go back to your father's house, and when he comes of age, then you can be his wife, and you can try to have an heir. And he basically is just trying to get rid of her, passing her off and leaving her there. So later on, she knows that he has no intention. Now the boy's grown up, and she hasn't been contacted. She hasn't been brought back into the family. She's just been left out to dry, all alone with no future. And so she poses as a prostitute as Judah's going into town, and he sleeps with her and gets her pregnant. And she takes his staff and his cord as payment, and then she disappears. He tries to send the goat back to get his staff and his cord back. The payment agreement was a goat. So he tries to send the goat with his friend Hiram to pay her off, and he can't find the temple prostitute. The townspeople know nothing about a prostitute who sits at the gate, because she just showed up that one day to connect with Judah and then went back home again and put her widow's clothes back on. So nobody knows that it was her. Nobody knows what's happened. 3 months later, now we find Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution. As a result, she's now pregnant. So Judah says, bring her out and have her burned to death. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law, I'm pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. Judah says, she is more righteous than I. In a culture that's so ready to punish the woman so quickly, it takes two to tango, right? So quick to punish the woman. But she has used the limited power that she has to say you need to get to the heart of the law. And she changed Judah. One commentator notes that the Judah that we see in the Bible after that is a different man. He's more concerned about doing what's right. So Judah is the one who suggested that they sell Joseph to the traders and sent him into Egypt. Judah is the one who came up with that idea. The Judah afterwards is the one who's willing to stay behind with Joseph in Egypt so that his brother can go back home. The Judah we see afterwards is the one who's ready to own up to his faults. He's a changed person after his encounter with Tamar. These are messy stories, right? They're messy. But these are the people that are named in Matthew. The only women named are these outsiders, foreigners to Israel, with messy, messy stories. So three truths that I believe we can learn about God's inclusivity. The first is that God is inclusive because of his grace, not because of our righteousness. I'm not telling these stories to excuse their actions. They're three very different stories, Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth. But in all of them, God invited them into his family. He honored the faith that they had, and he used them in his story of redemption. And God does the same with us. He chooses us. He welcomes us. He invites us. He rewards our faithfulness, even when our stories are messy. Do you ever feel like you aren't good enough for God? Do you ever feel like maybe you need to clean yourself up before you come to God? You don't. None of us are good enough. Even your best cleaning up efforts are still messy. So say yes to God's invitation to you. It's an invitation of grace. He's inclusive because of his grace. He invites you because of his grace. So just say yes. The second truth, I believe, is that God is inclusive because he loves the whole world, not just the insiders. The story of Israel is a story of God choosing a people and working through that people, but the story was always bigger than that. The story was always about the whole world. All three of these women were outsiders to the chosen people of Israel. But in Genesis 12:3, the promise that God makes to Abraham says that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Do you ever feel like an outsider to God's family? Maybe not only that you're not good enough for God, or maybe you feel like you're okay with God, but the church, maybe you're not quite good enough for them. I think you fit right in. If you feel like you're not good enough, you're probably just about right. Because again, none of us are good enough. None of us are perfect. We're not included in this family because we say the right things all the time or do the right things all the time, but because God has chosen us. Galatians 3 says, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. The way you become part of this family is not by being good enough. It's not by being perfect. It's not by never hurting anybody or never saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing or being annoying. We can be annoying sometimes, right? I can be annoying sometimes. And family life gets messy. But you're part of this family not because you're perfect, but because God has chosen you. And if you are in Christ, then you're an heir according to the promise, just the same as all the rest of the ones who've got the perfect lineage and all the things going for them. God's inclusive because he loves the whole earth, not just the insiders. So find your place in God's family. And thirdly, God is inclusive because he has a special concern for outsiders. Ruth and Naomi were poor, widowed, destitute, marginalized outsiders in Bethlehem. But God identifies himself. When he describes who he is and what he's like, he describes himself as a God who cares for widows and outsiders. In Deuteronomy, he says, teaching through Moses, the people of Israel, what kind of God he is and what they are to be like. He says, to the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth and everything in it. Yet the Lord set his affection on your ancestors and chose and loved them. And he chose you, their descendants, above all the nations, as it is today. So first of all, the insiders are chosen by God's grace, God's initiative, not their special worth. But he goes on, circumcise your hearts therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer. Don't be stubborn, don't be resistant any longer. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He's the God not just of these people, but the God of the whole world. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and he loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. So God identifies himself as someone who's concerned about the poor, concerned about the outsiders, concerned about the marginalized, the foreigners, the widows. And he reminds them, remember where you came from. You were foreigners in Egypt, and I chose you, not because you were super special, because I loved you. And now when there's foreigners among you, you need to love them too. Remember who you are, remember who I am, and love your neighbor. So God continues to teach us to mirror his character in caring for the outsiders. In James, he writes, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress. So what is it at times that makes you feel like an outsider? Do you ever feel like you have to hide your brokenness from the church? You are beloved by God and by us. One of the things that I am appreciating and enjoying about all of you so far is that you seem to really like each other. And maybe there's exceptions to that. I don't know. I haven't encountered those yet. But mostly, it seems like you really like each other, and I love that so much. If you ever feel like you need to hide from your church family, that's something broken. That's something from the enemy. That's not of God. God wants us to be people who accept one another, who love each other, who care for each other, even with our messiness, even with our faults and cracks. But the second challenge is, how open is your heart to the outsiders, those who aren't part of this community? In our community, in our world, do you work to provide a place of home, of clothing, of food for them? Do you openly offer welcome to others so that they can become part of God's family? And I know many of you are involved in that kind of work in our community, and I love that as well. Because I think this is who we are as God's people. We are people who were once foreigners in Egypt, and I use that metaphorically. We were once outsiders to God's family. Not very many of us, if any of us, are part of the nation of Israel, part of the Jewish lineage. We are all ones who have been grafted into this family of God, who've been invited in by God's grace. And now we who have said yes to his invitation, we who find a place in God's family, are then invited to offer healing to others in a grace-filled community. There's something powerful about a community of people that's welcoming, that's always paying attention to outsiders, to marginalized, who's always providing a place for them, a welcome for them, who in the tight-knit love and liking of each other and caring for each other that we share, that doesn't become a clique where other people can't come in, because we're always facing outwards, welcoming, inviting, making room, making space, making welcome. That's the kind of God we have. That's the story that Ruth's family teaches us. That's why these women are in this story, I think, is because it teaches us what God is like. And God is inclusive. He cares about the marginalized. He cares about the outsiders. We all belong because God is like this. Because he's gracious and inclusive, and he's invited all of us. So Deuteronomy, he reminds his people in Deuteronomy 7:8, it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery. God's initiative, God's grace. In John 15, Jesus said, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last." You are here because God has acted in your life. God is the initiator. And we are invited to respond to his love and acceptance of us. In Ephesians, Paul writes, "It is by grace you've been saved through faith. And this not from yourselves, it's the gift of God, not by works so that no one can boast." Do you ever feel like an outsider to God's plans? Like you're not good enough or you don't belong? You ever think you're too broken to belong in the church? And what is your perspective towards outsiders in our community? Towards those who are broken, who have messy lives and messy stories. Do you make them feel welcome and embraced as God has embraced you? Say yes to God's grace-filled invitation. Find your place in God's family and then offer healing to others in a grace-filled community. That's the challenge that I leave you with from this little book of Ruth and this crazy family that led us to Jesus. God, thank you for this story. Thank you for what we can learn from it. I just ask by your Spirit that you continue to challenge us and change us. Make us more like you as we learn to love each other and love our community. Father, give us eyes to see and ears to hear one another's cries and the ways that you're calling us to meet those needs. Father, open our hearts to know that you love us like crazy. You accept us as we are. And then you bring us into a community where we can find healing and hope. Thank you for walking with us, Jesus. Amen.